After the death of my father, my mom found someone else. My father left the house to me as an inheritance, but my mom and her new boyfriend moved into my house with his kids and started talking about their rights. I'm Jason, and I need to get this off my chest because I feel like my life is spiraling out of control. When I was 12, my dad passed away, and it shattered me. He was my rock, and losing him felt like the world had turned upside down. But it wasn't just the emotional loss that changed my life. He also left me a house worth $750,000 and a trust fund. At the time, I didn't think much about it because my mom, Emily, was managing everything until I turned 21. For a while, things were just sad but stable. My mom was doing her best, or at least that's what I thought. Then she met Mark. He was smooth-talking and full of big ideas, and before I knew it, they were married. Mark moved into the house, and he brought his 2 kids along, Tim, who was a year younger than me, and Lucy, who was just a kid back then. I tried to be open-minded. Losing my dad had been hard, and if my mom had found someone who made her happy, who was I to complain? But things started to change quickly. At first, it was little things. Mark would suggest redecorating the house, replacing furniture that had been there since my dad was alive. Then he decided my dad's office would make a great playroom for Lucy. When I pushed back, my mom just brushed me off, saying, "It's just a room, Jason. Don't be so dramatic." By the time I turned 18, the situation had spiraled out of control. Tim moved into my room because he needed more space. My belongings were shoved into the garage like they didn't matter. When I tried to protest, my mom just rolled her eyes and said, "Jason, you're barely here. Let Tim have the room. It's not a big deal." It wasn't just about the room. It was about feeling like I didn't belong in my own home anymore. Mark acted like he owned the place, hosting barbecues for his friends and making himself the center of attention. He'd crack jokes about how the house was finally a real family home, and everyone would laugh like it was some cute anecdote. My mom didn't seem to notice, or care, how much it hurt me to hear that. It was like everything my dad had built was being erased, piece by piece. As I got closer to my 21st birthday, I started counting down the days until I'd finally have control of the house and my trust fund. But it was clear my mom and Mark had other ideas. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Mark was saying something about refinancing the mortgage and long-term investments. My mom just nodded along like it was completely normal. The next morning, I confronted her. "What's going on with the house, Mom? I heard Mark talking about refinancing." "Oh, Jason, don't worry about it," she said, waving me off like I was overreacting. "Mark and I are just discussing ways to make the house more valuable. It's still your house, technically." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Technically?" I snapped. "It is my house." She gave me this exasperated look, like I was being unreasonable. "Jason, you're too young to understand how these things work. We're doing what's best for everyone." That conversation stuck with me, and it was all I could think about as my 21st birthday approached. When the day finally came, I was ready to take control. But when I brought it up to my mom, she acted surprised. "Oh, Jason, I thought we talked about this. Mark and I have been handling everything for so long. It just makes sense for us to keep managing it." "No," I said firmly. "It's time for me to take over." Her expression shifted, and that's when she dropped the bombshell. "Jason, the house isn't just yours anymore." I stared at her, my stomach dropping. "What are you talking about?" "We added Mark's name to the deed," she said, as casually as if she were telling me the weather forecast. "It's better this way. Now the house truly belongs to the family." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "You what? That's illegal. You can't just—" "Calm down," she interrupted. "We didn't do anything without a lawyer. It's all above board." I spent the next week poring over documents, trying to figure out what had happened. When I reached out to the lawyer who had handled my dad's will, I got the full picture. My mom had been dipping into the trust fund for years. Technically, she hadn't done anything illegal. She was listed as the trustee, but it was clear she'd been using the money for herself. Every so-called family expense had been paid for with what my dad had left me. When I confronted her about it, she acted offended. "Jason, everything I did was for you. Do you think running a house is cheap? Do you think raising a teenager is free? You didn't raise me, I shouted. You let Mark and his kids take over my life. She shook her head, looking at me like I was some ungrateful brat. You're being dramatic. You're an adult now. It's time to stop acting like a spoiled child. Things hit rock bottom last night. I came home from work to find they'd converted the garage, where all my stuff was stored, into a home office for Mark. My belongings, the last things that tied me to this house, had been tossed into trash bags and left on the curb like garbage. I can't keep living like this. It feels like I'm a stranger in the house my dad worked so hard to give me, surrounded by people who don't care about me. I've started looking for a lawyer to see if there's any way to undo what they've done, but it feels like an uphill battle. All I know is, something has to change. I woke up on my 21st birthday to an empty house. It wasn't surprising, but it still stung. A part of me had hoped that maybe, just maybe, my mom would put aside her usual priorities and remember that today was supposed to be about me. Instead, I found a note stuck to the fridge with Mark's sloppy handwriting. Jason, we've gone to the beach house for a little family vacation. Enjoy your day. Don't forget to lock up the house. Mark and Mom. Family vacation. The words tasted bitter. Apparently, I wasn't part of this so-called family anymore. My mom didn't even bother to sign her name. It was just Mark. That note was her final seal of approval on their little getaway, leaving me behind like an afterthought. They hadn't even invited me. It wasn't like I'd expected balloons or a surprise party, but being abandoned on my birthday felt like a new low. The silence in the house was deafening. Normally, I'd find a way to distract myself, but today it felt impossible. I wandered through the rooms, each one a reminder of how much had been taken from me. Tim's video games cluttered the living room. Lucy's drawings covered the fridge, each one taped up like some masterpiece. And me? I had a pile of boxes in the garage and a birthday that no one cared about. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. For a second, I thought maybe it was my mom or Mark realizing they'd forgotten me. But when I opened it, I saw my grandparents standing there, holding a cake and a couple of small, brightly wrapped gifts. "Happy birthday, Jason," my grandma said, pulling me into a hug. She smelled like lavender and sugar cookies, the same way she had since I was a kid. My grandpa handed me a card stuffed with $500 in cash, and they both gave me these warm, loving smiles that made my chest ache. They were the only people who cared enough to show up for me today. We sat at the kitchen table and ate the cake, which was simple but delicious, vanilla with thick chocolate frosting. My grandma asked how I was doing, and I couldn't bring myself to lie. I told them everything. How my mom and Mark had taken over the house, how I felt like a stranger in my own home, and how they'd left me behind for this so-called family vacation. My grandpa shook his head, his expression dark. "This is unacceptable, Jason. Your father worked his whole life to provide for you. He wouldn't have wanted this." My grandma nodded, her eyes wet with tears. "You deserve so much better, sweetheart. If your mom won't stand up for you, we will." Hearing them say that gave me a spark of hope. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was in my corner. They stayed for a few hours, telling me stories about my dad and reminding me that I wasn't alone, even if it felt like it sometimes. When they finally left, I felt a little less hollow inside. But the peace didn't last long. Later that evening, I got a call from my best friend, Ryan. He and I had grown up together, and he was one of the few people who knew the full story about my family situation. "Hey man," he said. "Happy birthday. What are you up to tonight?" "Nothing much," I admitted. "Mom and Mark ditched me for a vacation, so it's just me here." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're kidding me. They just left you alone on your birthday?" "Yep. Pretty on brand for them." "Dude, that's messed up. Come over to my place. We'll order pizza, watch some movies, whatever you want. You shouldn't be alone today." I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of sitting in the empty house all night was unbearable. "Yeah, okay. I'll be there in 20. Ryan lived in a small apartment across town with his older sister, Sarah. She was in her late 20s, worked as a graphic designer, and had always been like a big sister to me, too. When I got there, they had a small setup waiting for me. Pizza, a couple of beers, and even a little cupcake with a candle in it. It wasn't much, but it felt like the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for me in years. As the night went on, we talked about everything. my plans for the future, the mess with my mom and Mark, and how I was finally going to take control of my life now that I was 21. Sarah, always the practical one, suggested I talk to a lawyer about the house and my trust fund. You have rights, Jason, she said firmly. They can't just push you out of your own home. If they've done anything shady with your money, you need to know. Ryan chimed in. Yeah, man. You can't let them walk all over you. Your dad wouldn't want that. Hearing them say that lit a fire in me. For too long, I'd let my mom and Mark steamroll me, convincing myself that I didn't have the power to fight back. But now, I realized I did. I didn't have to accept this as my reality. When I got home that night, the house felt even emptier than before. But this time, the emptiness didn't feel as crushing. Instead, it felt like a blank slate, a chance to start fresh. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had the strength to face it. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer my grandparents had recommended, someone who specialized in estate law. The second was to a locksmith. If Mark and my mom wanted to treat me like I didn't belong, then fine. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them to walk all over me anymore. When the locksmith arrived later that afternoon, I had him change every lock in the house. By the time he was done, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It was a small step, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Once I got the locks changed, I finally started to feel like I had some control over my life again. But the real fight was just beginning. The next step was to get the title deeds and legally take back ownership of the house. My grandparents were a huge help. They were furious when I told them everything Mark and my mom had done, and they wasted no time getting involved. My grandpa reached out to one of his old friends, Mr. Lawson, a retired attorney who specialized in estate law. He agreed to meet with us the next day. When we walked into his office, I was struck by how sharp and professional he looked despite his age. His gray suit was perfectly tailored, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to miss nothing. Jason, he said after I explained everything, this is a mess, but it's not insurmountable. Your father's will clearly stated that the house and trust fund were meant for you. Your mother had no legal right to add anyone to the deed without your consent. Hearing that felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Finally, someone was validating what I'd been saying all along. Mr. Lawson outlined the steps we needed to take. First, filing a formal complaint to contest the changes to the deed, and then initiating eviction proceedings if necessary. The whole process was going to be complicated and expensive, but my grandparents insisted on covering the legal fees. This is your inheritance, Jason, my grandma said firmly. We're not going to let them take it from you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and phone calls. My mom and Mark were still on vacation, blissfully unaware of what was happening. I had no intention of telling them until I had everything in place. Let them enjoy their little trip. They'd come home to a surprise they wouldn't forget. While we were working on the legal side of things, I started making other changes around the house. I went through every room and started packing up anything that didn't belong to me. Tim's video games, Lucy's toys, Mark's endless collection of grilling tools. All of it went into boxes and bags, which I stacked in the garage. It felt cathartic, like I was finally reclaiming my space. One day, while I was clearing out the living room, I found a stack of documents shoved into a drawer. They were utility bills, credit card statements, and bank records, all in my mom's name but with my trust fund listed as the payment source. My blood boiled as I realized just how much she'd been siphoning off. Thousands of dollars had been spent on things like luxury vacations, home renovations, and even a new car for Mark. It was more proof of their betrayal, and I made sure to add it to the growing pile of evidence we were compiling for the case. When my mom and Mark finally came back from their vacation, the look on their faces was priceless. They walked through the door, suitcases in hand, only to find the locks changed and their things packed up in the garage. My mom started banging on the door, yelling, "Jason, what the hell is going on?" I opened the door just enough to face her. "You don't live here anymore," I said calmly. "This is my house, and I'm taking it back." She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This is my home too." "No," I shot back. "It's not. It's my home. It always has been." And you've done nothing but take advantage of me since Dad died. Mark, of course, tried to play the tough guy. He pushed past my mom and got right in my face. Listen here, kid, he snarled. You think you can just throw us out? You don't have the guts. I stared him down, my heart pounding but my voice steady. I already filed the paperwork. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. His face turned bright red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually hit me. But then he backed off, muttering something under his breath about ungrateful brats. My mom tried a different tactic. She started crying, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to reconsider. Jason, please. We're your family. We just wanted to make this house a home. You had 10 years to make it a home, I said, my voice cold. All you did was push me out. They eventually left, but not without making a scene. Lucy was crying, Tim was sulking, and Mark was yelling about how I'd regret this. I stood in the doorway and watched them drive away, their car packed to the brim with the boxes I'd prepared. It felt like a victory, but it was bittersweet. This wasn't how I wanted things to go, but they'd left me no choice. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle heated up. My mom and Mark tried everything to fight back, claiming that the house was as much theirs as it was mine. But the evidence was overwhelmingly in my favor. The will, the trust fund records, the fraudulent changes to the deed. It all painted a clear picture of what they'd done. One day, during a particularly tense meeting with their lawyer, my mom finally snapped. "This is all your fault, Jason," she screamed, her voice shaking with anger. "If you weren't so selfish, none of this would be happening." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Selfish? I shot back. You stole from me. You let Mark and his kids take over my life. And now you're calling me selfish? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she broke down in tears, sobbing about how hard it had been to raise me on her own after Dad died. But I wasn't buying it anymore. Her choices had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with her own greed and insecurity. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. The deed was reverted back to my name, and my mom and Mark were officially evicted. I had my house back, but it came at a cost. My relationship with my mom was shattered, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. Through it all, my grandparents were my rock. They stood by me every step of the way, offering their support and guidance. Without them, I don't know if I would have had the strength to fight back. They reminded me of the kind of family my dad had wanted for me. One built on love, not manipulation. As I stood in the empty house, finally mine again, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and hope. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could finally build a life on my own terms. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew I was ready for it. After the court ruled in my favor, I was legally the sole owner of the house again. I wanted to celebrate, but the battle wasn't over. Legally, my mom, Mark, and their kids had 45 days to vacate the property, and I had to be the one to tell them. I dreaded the conversation, but it had to be done. When I arrived at their rental apartment, because, of course, they were staying in a rental even though Mark always acted like they owned the house, I knocked on the door. Mark answered, looking as smug as ever. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Big Shot," he sneered. "What do you want?" "I'm here to let you know," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You have 45 days to move out. That's the court's ruling. You've had enough time to figure things out." My mom appeared behind him, her face pale. "Jason, can't we talk about this?" she pleaded. "We're family. Do you really want to throw us out like this?" "You had years to make this right," I replied coldly. "You didn't care about me or what Dad left me. You only cared about yourselves." Tim and Lucy hovered in the background, whispering to each other. I felt a pang of guilt when I saw Lucy's wide, confused eyes, but I reminded myself that this wasn't my fault. They brought this on themselves. Mark's bravado faltered. "Fine," he grumbled. "But don't think this is over. You'll regret this." The next 6 weeks were a nightmare. Instead of packing up and leaving quietly, they made things as difficult as possible. I'd go to the house to check on their progress, only to find that almost nothing had been done. Instead, the kids had started treating the house like a playground. They left toys scattered everywhere, and I once found a half-eaten sandwich shoved into the couch cushions. Mark and my mom were no better. They fought constantly, their arguments echoing through the house. It was clear the stress was getting to them, and they didn't bother to hide it from the kids. One afternoon, I stopped by and found the kitchen in complete disarray. Spoiled food had been left out, attracting ants, and the trash can was overflowing. It was disgusting. "You can't leave the house like this," I told my mom angrily. "This is my home." "Don't lecture me, Jason," she snapped. "You've already won. Just let us live in peace until we're gone." But they didn't leave in peace. As the deadline drew closer, their behavior only got worse. Tim and Lucy had taken to throwing things around the house. Books, dishes, even some of my belongings that I hadn't yet moved back into my room. I later calculated they damaged at least $200 worth of my stuff. Then there were the petty acts of defiance. Mark would crank up the volume on the TV whenever I came by, blasting some obnoxious talk show. My mom would give me the silent treatment, refusing to acknowledge me even when I was standing right in front of her. It was exhausting, but I reminded myself that it was almost over. When the 45 days finally expired, I showed up at the house, half expecting them to still be there. But when I opened the door, I was greeted by silence. They were gone, but they left behind a mess that made my stomach turn. The carpets were stained, the walls were covered in scuff marks, and the refrigerator was filled with rotting food. One of the toilets had been clogged and left that way, and the garage was full of random junk they hadn't bothered to take with them. It was like they'd done everything they could to leave the house in the worst possible condition. As I stood there, taking it all in, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. I didn't want to answer, but something told me I should. When I picked up, her voice was calm, too calm. "Jason," she began, "I just want to let you know that we're out of the house, as you demanded." "Yeah, I can see that," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "What I don't see is why you thought it was okay to leave the place like a dumpster." She ignored my comment. "I've been talking to some of our relatives, and they're very disappointed in you. They think you've been cruel and unfair." I felt my blood boil. "Unfair? Mom, you stole from me. You and Mark trashed my house. And now you're trying to make me the bad guy?" "I'm just saying," she said, her voice taking on a manipulative edge, "you might want to reconsider your actions before this goes any further. Mark and I are thinking about getting a lawyer." That made me laugh, a bitter, humorless sound. "Go ahead. Sue me. You'll lose, just like you lost in court." She hung up on me after that, but her words lingered. I knew my mom well enough to know she wouldn't let this go easily. Over the next few days, I started getting calls and texts from family members I hadn't heard from in years. They all had the same message. "Why are you doing this to your mom? She's your mother. She raised you. You owe her better than this." It was infuriating. She'd clearly gone out of her way to paint herself as the victim, conveniently leaving out the part where she and Mark had spent years stealing from me and treating me like an afterthought. I tried explaining the truth to some of them, but it felt like talking to a brick wall. They didn't want to hear it. They'd already made up their minds. The worst part was the guilt. No matter how much I reminded myself that I was in the right, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should have handled things differently. But then I'd look around at the mess they'd left behind, or remember all the times they dismissed me, and my resolve would harden again. Over the next few weeks, I focused on cleaning up the house and making it mine again. My grandparents helped as much as they could, scrubbing walls, replacing damaged furniture, and even repainting some of the rooms. They were my lifeline during that time, reminding me that I wasn't alone and that I was doing the right thing. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the garage, I found an old photo album my dad had put together. It was filled with pictures of him, me, and my mom back when things were good. Seeing those photos brought tears to my eyes. I realized how much I missed the family we used to be, and how much I resented what we'd become. After weeks of dealing with the fallout, I was finally starting to feel like the house was mine again. But it wasn't just my grandparents who stepped up to help. My great-uncle David, my dad's older brother, reached out after hearing about everything. He'd been somewhat estranged from the family for years, but he and my dad had been close when they were younger. I guess the news of what happened brought him back into the fold. Uncle David was a no-nonsense kind of guy, a retired contractor who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He showed up at the house one afternoon with a toolbox in one hand and a folder full of paperwork in the other. "Jason," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "your dad would be rolling over in his grave if he saw what your mom and that husband of hers did to this place. Let's fix it." I was taken aback at first. I hadn't seen Uncle David since I was a kid, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But as the weeks went on, he proved to be one of my biggest allies. He not only helped me tackle the physical repairs the house desperately needed, but also walked me through the legal steps I needed to ensure this never happened again. One of the first things we did was secure the property. Uncle David had connections in the construction world and managed to get a security system installed at a discount. He insisted it was necessary, especially after hearing about Mark's veiled threats. "You never know what people like him will do when they're backed into a corner," he said. "Better safe than sorry." With the security system in place, we turned our attention to the repairs. The house was in rough shape after everything my mom and her family had done. The walls were scuffed, the carpets were ruined, and the kitchen was practically a biohazard. Uncle David took one look at the state of the place and declared, "This is going to be a full-blown project, but don't worry, we'll get it done." My grandparents pitched in, too. My grandma, despite her age, was a cleaning powerhouse. She spent hours scrubbing every inch of the kitchen, determined to make it livable again. My grandpa handled the finances, helping me budget for the repairs. Between the three of them, I finally felt like I had a team I could rely on. The first $15,000 I spent went toward the essentials: replacing the ruined carpets, repainting the walls, and fixing the plumbing issues in the bathroom. Uncle David handled most of the work himself, refusing to let me pay for labor. "This is for your dad," he said gruffly when I tried to argue. "He'd want me to do this for you." One of the most satisfying moments came when we tackled the living room. It had been the heart of the house when my dad was alive, but over the years, it had been taken over by Mark's tacky furniture and Tim's video games. We ripped out the old, stained carpet and replaced it with hardwood floors. I picked out a new couch and a coffee table, both simple and sturdy. When it was finished, it finally felt like my living room again. As we worked on the house, Uncle David shared stories about my dad that I'd never heard before. He told me about the time they built a treehouse together as kids, about how my dad used to sneak out to watch movies when they were teenagers, and about how proud he'd been when I was born. Hearing those stories made me feel closer to my dad, like I was finally reclaiming a part of him that I'd lost. But not everything was smooth sailing. My mom didn't give up easily. True to her word, she tried to stir up trouble by manipulating other relatives. She called my Aunt Linda, her sister, and told her I was destroying the family by taking the house back. Aunt Linda, who'd always been quick to jump to my mom's defense, called me one evening, furious. "Jason," she said, "how could you do this to your mother? She sacrificed so much for you, and this is how you repay her." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Aunt Linda, you don't know the whole story. Mom and Mark were stealing from me. They added Mark's name to the deed without my consent, and they left the house in ruins." She didn't want to hear it. "That's not what your mother said. She told me you're kicking them out because you're greedy." It was exhausting trying to explain the truth to people who didn't want to believe it. Eventually, I decided I wasn't going to waste my energy on them anymore. The people who really mattered, my grandparents, Uncle David, and a few close friends, knew the truth, and that was enough for me. Once the initial repairs were finished, I started thinking about the future. The house was more than just a building to me. It was a connection to my dad, a place where I could finally feel safe and grounded. I decided to turn one of the spare rooms into an office, something I'd always wanted but never had the space for. Uncle David helped me build custom shelves for my books, and I spent hours organizing everything just the way I liked it. It was a small thing, but it made the house feel like mine. Another project I took on was the backyard. It had been neglected for years, overrun with weeds and debris. I remembered how much my dad had loved gardening, so I decided to bring the space back to life. With Uncle David's guidance, I planted flowers along the fence and built a small vegetable garden in the corner. My grandparents even pitched in, donating some of their favorite plants from their own garden. By the time we were finished, the backyard was unrecognizable. It was beautiful, a place where I could imagine my dad smiling down on me. One day, as we were wrapping up work for the evening, Uncle David turned to me and said, "You've done a good job, Jason. Your dad would be proud." Hearing that made everything worth it. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was my home, a place where I could finally start to heal. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. And with the support of my grandparents and Uncle David, I knew I could handle whatever came next. The house was finally mine, and I could breathe again. Every corner of it now carried my touch, a reflection of who I was and who I wanted to become. The battle to reclaim it had left me emotionally drained, but it had also taught me something important. I had the strength to stand up for myself, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against me. Despite everything, I believed I'd made the right decision.